Welcome to the house, where live pop culture and faith collide. How you doing today? We have a few weeks left in the contemporary worship service. And I want to spend that time remembering what the service was all about, remembering the values that we try to teach. Over the last couple of years, one of the core values that we've really tried to push was the understanding that as human beings, we have a responsibility, to take care of people, to stand up for what's right, to stand up to bullies, to stand up to people who want to hurt other people. And, people can get hurt in all different kinds of ways. And so those conversations can be quite complicated. I was watching Dave Chappelle's 846 the other day. Came out just a couple of days ago. And it's a reference to the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that the police officer kneeled on George Floyd's neck until he died. And, I would recommend this to anybody. I'm a huge Chappelle fan, but I think anybody who's interested in trying to understand all the craziness in 2020 would get something out of watching this, specifically when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, in the special, he talks about the concept of time. And I started thinking about, well, is 8 minutes and 46 seconds a long amount of time? And, I started to appreciate how important context is to any conversation. Especially when we're trying to talk about, really serious stuff, with the difference between right and wrong, we need context, so is 8 minutes and 46 seconds a long amount of time? Well, if you're having fun, if you're having a great time, then 8 minutes and 46 seconds is nothing. But if you're in pain and you're suffering, then 8 minutes and 46 seconds is an eternity. So context can change the outcome of any conversation. Like breaking a window. Is breaking a window a good or a bad thing to do? Well, breaking a window in the context of looting, so that you can go in and steal a bunch of stuff, is not such a great thing to do. Breaking a window in the context of a burning house so that you can get out and not die, well, that's a pretty good idea, right? So, when it comes to is all lives matter an appropriate response to Black Lives Matter, on a very superficial level, do Black lives matter? Yes. Do all lives matter? Yes. How do you settle an argument between two sides that are both saying something that is factually true? Context. And in my opinion, there is no better context to have than biblical context. So, let's go to Matthew chapter 18, verses 12 to 14. In this chunk of scripture, Jesus is telling his disciples a story, the parable of the lost sheep. He tells them that there's a shepherd, and he has 100 sheep. And one day, one of those sheep goes missing. And he says that it's a natural response for the shepherd to go out to find this sheep. And when and if he finds this sheep, he will rejoice in a way that appears as if he cares about this one lost sheep more than the other 99 sheep that are at home. And in the same way, God rejoices when even one person comes to salvation. Now, in order to understand how this parable can help us process what is happening in the Black Lives Matter movement, we have to understand what this parable is teaching us about what it means to be lost. The first thing that it has to teach us is that being lost means being physically isolated and separated from the rest of the group. That's exactly what happens to the sheep, and that's why the shepherd has to go out into the world to look for him. I think it's pretty clear that the black community in this country has been isolated and separated from the rest of the group, and all you have to do is look at the historical context of this country. Before America became America, back in the 1600s when we were still a British colony, there were these groups of people running around called slave patrols, and they were that era's version of modern-day law enforcement. And their purpose was to keep slaves in check, to keep them from committing crimes, to keep them from running away, to keep them from organizing rebellions against white slave owners. And the whole goal of all of this was to keep the rich white man in power. So then you fast forward, another few hundred years, and we see that slavery becomes illegal. But that doesn't mean that suddenly the slave owner mentality flips, overnight to thinking that the institution of slavery is immoral and evil. They continue to teach this mentality to their kids and to their kids after that. And so for generations, the idea that a person of color is inferior, that a person of color can be treated as an object, that it's okay for a person of color to be treated as less than a white person, those things continue to be taught in this country. So is it a surprise that the black community in this country feels a strong sense of isolation and separation from the rest of the group when these kinds of ideas are still being taught today? Now, the Greek word translated as to be lost in the parable can also mean to be misled or deceived. And so the sheep in the parable also represent the people in the world who are spiritually lost, who have been misled and deceived into believing something that is not true. And so to be lost doesn't just mean to be isolated and separated physically from a group. It also means to be misled and deceived in a way that you no longer have a sense of community with the people around you. And that is exactly what has happened to the black community in this country. Given the history of slave patrols that we have, those were law enforcement officials that represented and promoted the interests of slave owners, and the tactics that they would use to do their jobs would be considered today to be police brutality. And they would pass down that mentality generation after generation after generation, even after the abolition of slavery, because laws change behavior, not hearts. And so today, when I look at a police officer, I see something very different than when a black person sees a police officer. I see a symbol of safety, of protection, and of freedom. And for so many of the people in the black community, they see the exact opposite. They see a symbol of violence, of fear, and of oppression. So if we can agree that the black community has been isolated, has been separated, has been deceived, and has been misled, if we can agree that that's the problem, then that frees us to move into the space where we can try to find what an appropriate response would be. And that is also found in the parable of the lost sheep. Jesus teaches his disciples that when the shepherd sees that his sheep is lost, is isolated, separated, misled, deceived, and therefore in danger, it is a natural response for this shepherd to want to remove his sheep from danger, and that is because the shepherd loves his sheep. Jesus is trying to teach us a model for what love is. He's teaching us that if you say that you care about somebody, if you say that you love somebody and you see them in danger, you will accept the natural accountability that comes along with that love and try to help them to remove them from that danger. And if we can accept that, then we can move past this conversation of Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter being a competition of two factual statements. Because in this context, Black Lives Matter is not a factual statement, it is a cry for help. It is an acknowledgement by the black community that they are in danger, and responding to a cry for help with a factual statement, like all lives matter, is insufficient. It reveals indifference, it reveals a lack of accountability, and it reveals the intention of, as I sit here and see you suffer, I will choose to do nothing about it. And in that context, all lives matter is not a factual statement, it is a justification for laziness. And so the real question is, do Black lives matter to you? As Christians, as human beings, we can and should do better than all lives matter. Peace.